Hey everybody, welcome to the Slick Tree Podcast. I'm your host, Colby Langford. The point of this show is to help improve ourselves as dogmen and to raise the quality of the dogs on the end of our lead. So let's settle in, turn the volume up, and let's see if we can't learn a trick or two together from our guests. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in today. We have got Mike Snyder with Wild Wise Botanicals on the phone. How are you doing today, Mike?
Hey, I'm doing great, Colby. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Well, just to let everybody know what we're talking about, it's my personal favorite bycatch while I'm out in the woods, squirrel and coon hunting and everything else. But it's wild mushrooms. It's something that I feel like a lot of people in this community don't really know that much about, and it's a shame because they're walking past a lot of really good eating that's just sitting there on the ground and on stumps out in the woods. But let's start off, Mike. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I've been into mushrooms for about 15 years now. So I'm not really old school, not really new school, more kind of middle school. I've been doing this for a while. Started out as just a hobby, and I spent about 10 years in the woods just kind of super nerding out on mushrooms. We bought some property in southern Phelps County and kind of developed our own little homestead here. We've got a creek running through the place. So I started to see a lot of mushrooms, and I'd already been kind of interested in them before we moved here. But when we got here, our first spring, we found, like 100 morels down in the creek bottom. That was really exciting. We had kind of preteen kids at the time. So that was really fun. So I just started to notice all these different mushrooms that I was encountering just right outside my house. And I got even more curious, read a ton of books, did that for about 10 years. And so I just really learned a lot on my own by just reading books and not really interacting with any other mushroom people. And all the people in the area I live in, they just think wild mushrooms. They just think morels, which is fine. And morels are great. There's lots of other good ones. And I really started to dive deep and learn about all those different kinds. I found the Missouri Mycological Society after about 10 years in the woods by myself. Joined that club, and I started interacting with some actual mushroom people, which I had no idea existed before that. And I was really excited, and I started to learn really quickly that I had amassed a great deal of knowledge about the subject. And so I decided to start leading forays, and I've done a ton of workshops for the club, and also started my own business with my wife, Wild Wise Botanicals. Be sure and check us out on Facebook, Instagram, all the good things. We offer workshops and classes. I do speaking engagements, all kinds of really fun kind of mushroom foraging centered stuff. So that's kind of where we're at today. Um, I like to teach people about mushrooms, and I'm glad to be on this because I know that all of my hunting neighbors encounter tons of good mushrooms, and they just don't know what they are. They could be adding that to their wonderful meal of harvested protein that they got.
Yeah, kind of on that same note, I guess it would have been about. So there's a website I'm sure you're not aware of, but it's called Squirrel Dog Central, and it was back in the days before Facebook was popular. It was a message forum, and that was popular with the squirrel hunting squirrel dog community. But I had seen where someone had made a post and had some pictures, but they were talking about they'd been out. It was in the fall, and they'd been out and they'd found a bunch of golden trumpets while they were out squirrel hunting. I just kind of glanced over it and read over, like, and how like they were named that because that's kind of what they look like. They kind of look like an orange little megaphone, and I didn't think too much about it at the time, and then it wasn't, but probably more than a week or so later, and I was at my brother's house and we walked out. He had a little plot of woods behind his house at the time, and we walked out there and we were looking at his tree stand or something along those lines, and there was a whole bunch of them just popped up everywhere. And I said, "Hey, I think these are what they called them golden trumpet things." And there was two or three of us there. I think we were getting ready to go to a concert, and so we ended up walking back up to the house, which wasn't more than 150 yards or so. And I got my phone out and got back, found that website again, and found that on the forum, and looked it up and thought, sure enough, like, hey, that's what these are. We really found them. Let's go back and pick some, and we went out and picked some, and we fried them up, and that's kind of what set me off on the whole mushroom adventure myself. Because don't take me wrong, I love morels, and I'm not going to step over them and walk past them in the woods, but they're far from my favorite wild mushrooms.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you must be talking about chanterelles that you
Yes.
found. Is that
Yep.
right?
Yep. Chanterelles.
Yeah. So
Uh,
chanterelles are one of the first wild mushrooms that I learned after morels. They're the perfect mushroom for people, especially here in this region of the country, in the Midwest or the lower Midwest. Actually, almost the entire continent has chanterelles of some sort, and they can just be so abundant. And if you have oak dominant woods, you're going to have chanterelles in the summer after some rain. So they're really easy to find. They're bright orange, they kind of glare out at you. They're not hidden in the leaves like morels.
Pretty easy to identify, just in the fact that they don't have gills. So for anybody listening, like I said, they look like just like a little, like an old time record player. The little speaker cone that comes out on it. But they'll be smooth or they can be ribbed on bottom. But if you try to pull those little ribs apart, where gills would be on a normal mushroom, they're solid. They don't actually come apart. They're just lines on the bottom side of them. But man, they are
Yeah.
absolutely delicious.
Yeah, that's actually a good description of the difference between gills and the so-called false gills, who are basically just a series of ridges on the underside of the trumpet. One of my favorite ways to show people how to 100% identify a chanterelle is to get the mushroom and just tear it in half from top to bottom. And the interior of a chanterelle is white and it has kind of a stringy texture to it that reminds you of like pulling a chicken strip apart or a piece of string cheese. And that isn't how most mushrooms are. They're kind of more brittle and they'll snap or crumble as you try to do this or smash. Chanterelles very firm. You pull them apart, they're white inside and have that kind of stringy texture. And that's a really surefire way. And once you kind of key into that, you'll never have to tear one in half again. You're just like, oh yeah, I know what that is.
Hmm.
But yeah, really good beginner mushroom, and like you said, easy to identify and abundant. Those are the three. Those are the three top things that you want in a wild mushroom.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the bright orange, like you touched on, being bright orange. They're not like a morel where you're crawling around on your hands and knees looking for little camouflage mushrooms. I mean, they're about the loudest thing in the woods. They just kind of scream at you when you walk past them.
They really do. Yeah, they really do. And sometimes you'll find a patch in the woods where there's literally hundreds of them scattered all around an entire hillside. So yeah, they're a lot of fun and easy to identify. The first couple of times that you find a new mushroom and you're like, okay, I think it's that one. You really should just try a really small amount of it the first time, just in case it is some toxic mushroom or you have some sort of reaction to that species. You never know. So I always recommend people try a small amount, and really before you try a new mushroom, you should probably encounter it a few times and just kind of look at its features and look it up and do the identification process, and then give it a shot at eating it. Now, that's my advice, but of course, most people don't do that.
I've
Like you and your friends, like you and your friends with the trumpets, you're like, yeah, yeah, we found them, let's eat them, and I am the same way, and especially when I first started foraging, I was definitely that way, but that rule isn't as important when you're talking about a mushroom like a morel or a chicken of the woods or something that's really distinctive. You really can't mistake it for much else.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and plug my favorite mushroom book, which is the Missouri's Wild Mushrooms. I think they're about $30 now by the time you add shipping on them. But the only place you can get them that's not outrageously priced, you can find them on Amazon, but they're a third party seller and they mark them way up. But if you get on Missouri's Department of Wildlife website and go to their gift shop, you can find it in their book section. Uh, but it's just a really good. It's the best book I found just because it's got I think 100 or so different mushrooms in it. There's color pictures. It's got so if you pull up a page and you look at it, if there's any lookalikes that mushroom has, it'll also have the page number to reference for possible lookalikes, whether or not they're poisonous. It's got kind of the season that it grows, the habitat, a size description, uh, and like you were saying, ways to identify them. I have never actually spore printed a mushroom. I've read about it, and this book goes really well into detail on breaking mushrooms down by the type, as far as whether they're like a guild cap or a well, my brain just went
Yeah,
dead.
like a shelf like mushroom,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, there's all kinds of just kind of yeah. That book organizes them by their morphology, we call it, like their shape and
Yes.
their basic overall form. And that's a really good approach for beginners because then it's just really approachable. You can look at the little picture and say, "Oh, I see. They're all a cap and stem mushroom in this section, or they're all shaped mushrooms, or they're all squiggly jelly mushrooms or whatever."
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I like that approach. And yeah, that's a great book. That was my first mushroom book that I got. I think I bought it like the year after it was published, and that was early on in my mushroom adventures, I guess you could say. And I just kind of used it as a checklist. I wanted to learn all the mushrooms in there, and I eventually did. And I found them all, and so that was a lot of fun. It's a good book, and it's put together well for beginners. And also, you pointed out, it doesn't have an overwhelming number of mushrooms in it,
Mm-hmm.
and all the mushrooms that are in there can be found in your region. If you live in Missouri or the surrounding states, you're going to be able to find pretty much all of the mushrooms that are in the book at some point. Uh, Whereas, like, if you get mushrooms of North America, then it has 800 or 1,000 species in it or whatever, and half of them don't grow here, then that is just really overwhelming and hard to wade through as a newbie.
That was my
So yeah,
exact my exact thing I was going to say is it's just overwhelming for the non-localized field guides is there's just too many that are too similar and it's too much to wade through.
and honestly, it's not worth doing that as a beginner anyway, especially if you're just trying to get some good food out of the woods. You don't have to learn the 6,000 species that occur in Missouri or whatever. You don't have to do that. Just start with the ones that are easier and the ones that even if maybe you had thought before when you're in the woods, hunting, and you thought, oh yeah, I've seen that big bright orange one. We saw that thing. It was crazy. And then if you see it in a book and you see the picture and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that one before, then you can kind of read about it and start to learn what it is. And I think that most hunters would start to realize that they see a ton of good edible mushrooms in the woods. Another thing I always like to point out is don't be too afraid of mushrooms. I know a lot of people have been taught, mushrooms will kill you, don't even touch them, but it's actually safe to touch any mushroom, even the very most deadly ones, because you can only be poisoned by a mushroom if you eat it and your body digests it. So
I did
the
not know that.
toxins in yeah, the toxins in mushrooms either affect your GI tract and give you, acute GI distress. I think we all know what that means. Or they are filtered through your kidneys and liver, and then they cause damage to those organs. So yeah, you can pick up even the most deadly mushrooms, and you can pick them up and look at them, and as long as you don't eat them, you're safe. So that's it. I actually recommend that people pick up the mushroom and look at it because that's how you get familiar with its features, and learn how to identify it next time. Also, another thing to point out is that there's a lot of fear of mushrooms, but this tends to be a cultural thing, and it's kind of just how people are raised. If you go to like Northern European countries, lots of Asian countries, there are kids who are just taught mushrooms from the time they can toddle around, just like we're taught, what a squirrel is and what a chipmunk is and the difference kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we here in the United States and in lots of European countries where our ancestors come from, they have a fear of mushrooms. So it's just kind of culturally ingrained in us. But like I said, you can't die from touching a mushroom or be poisoned in any way. And also, it's important to point out that only 1% to 2% of mushroom species are toxic at all. So most mushrooms are non-toxic. There aren't as many poisonous mushrooms as there are poisonous plants. So those are things that most people don't realize. And once you do kind of learn those things, you realize, well, maybe just people are a little too afraid of mushrooms. That being said, I'm not saying just go eat them because only 1% is poisonous.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to figure out what mushroom you're looking at before you eat it. And it isn't that hard, especially if you have something conspicuous like a morel or even a chanterelle or a chicken of the woods or something like that. Something that's you can easily tell, what it is if you just do a little bit of homework.
Probably the I have a lot of people, which I've given away. I don't know how many of these Missouri mushroom books as gifts to friends and buddies of mine over the years. But I have a lot of people that send me pictures wanting help to identify them, which is great, and I don't mind at all. But if and what I started doing when I got the book, because I don't carry the book, even though it does fit in a gallon Ziploc bag perfectly. Uh, I don't usually carry the book with me when I'm in the woods, especially when I was learning at more and getting
Sure.
started. I didn't, uh, but taking good pictures, which everybody has a camera phone on them these days. But if you're walking along, say you
Yeah.
find some mushrooms, don't just take a picture from the top side. Uh, to try to identify them, because you can go home and you can always go back and learn that mushroom without actually picking them and carrying any of them out of the woods. But if you take a picture of the top
Yeah.
side and take a detailed picture of the bottom side of the cap, and kind of take some in situ pictures of where the mushroom's growing at, what it's growing on, uh, really helps in properly identifying it instead of just taking a couple pictures of it from the top side, because a lot of mushrooms look similar from the top and you just can't tell what they are.
That is very true. I get a lot of ID requests, and yeah, sometimes it'll just be the picture of the top of a brown mushroom, and I have to send them back and just I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't identify that mushroom. It could be this or this, maybe because of the location. I can see it's growing in wood chips, or it's springtime or whatever, but there's no way to identify that mushroom. Yeah, it's really important to get a picture of the top. It's nice to have a photo of the whole mushroom from the side, like just kind of lay it down on the ground or get it down low and take a picture from the side. And then a picture of the underside, like you said, especially with like uh, gilled mushrooms, you can really learn a lot from the underside if you know what features to look for. And yeah, if you take a few good pictures of a mushroom, you can go stick that thing on a Facebook group. The Missouri Mycological Society's Facebook group is great, and if you take some good pictures, there will be someone on there who can identify it for you.
And I believe, which most of the people listening to this are kind of going to be Missouri, Arkansas, on up and through Tennessee, Kentucky, up kind of through Appalachia. I'm going to assume that most states probably have like a state-based mycological society like Facebook page or something they can jump on and try to learn some more about their area on.
Yeah, several of the surrounding states do, but don't let that stop you from checking out the Missouri Club because it is actually one of the biggest and most active clubs in the country at this point, and certainly in the Midwest. So, Missouri Club is really great. We do a lot of, we have forays every weekend through the season where you can just kind of go in the woods for a couple hours with somebody who knows a little bit about mushrooms, and you can really learn a lot from something like that because you're actually in the woods, you're seeing the mushrooms firsthand, you're, interacting with the person who knows about them. So that's really valuable. We also, a couple of times a year, have these weekend camp out kind of forays, and they're a lot of fun. We usually have a couple of mushroom focused speakers. We go out on forays and try to find old mushrooms, and it's really a good time. Um, yeah, other than that, mycological societies are great. And I'm pretty sure that every state has at least one, usually focused in a city, but often they'll offer things throughout their state.
One of the most common mushrooms I probably come across, which uh, there are some squirrel hunters that'll hunt year round with their dogs, but as far as fall, wintertime, oysters. They are the most prevalent that I find in my area, and I've even chipped ice off the top of them this time of year, and had perfectly prime fresh mushrooms underneath a
Yeah.
snowy ice top on top of them, which is just kind of a crazy thing
Yeah.
to think of.
Yeah, oysters are tough. They are one of the most aggressive and vigorous groups of mushrooms that we have here. And you're right, they're very common through the fall and even in the winter. If it warms up a little bit, there's going to be some oysters somewhere. But that's a good mushroom, a pretty easy one to learn. It does have some, lookalikes, but the key things for that one is they're a lighter color, usually grayish, brownish, white color. In the winter months, the colder months, they're usually darker colored, so you see more of the grays and browns. Through the summer, it'd be more kind of the whites coming through, but they grow in clusters directly from wood, and their stem is kind of unique. If you look underneath their cap, the gills of the mushroom, so the thin blade-like gills underneath, they run down the stem down to where, usually almost to where it's attached to the wood or the rest of the cluster. So those are called decurrent gills, and they just go down the stem, which most gill mushrooms, think about it, they're kind of an umbrella. The gills just stop right at the stem, and then the stem is a separate thing. But with oysters, they run down it, and those are decurrent gills. So that's a really good way. That light colored mushroom grows in clusters on wood with the decurrent gills. Those are the main features of oysters, and once you key into them times, you'll know them every time.
And they do have a little bit of a smell like an oyster, which I think is where
Yeah,
they might have got their name at.
yeah, they do. They say that the name is because they're shaped like an oyster.
They're pretty good if you batter and fry them up, which is what the way I cook a lot of mine. I've got a few other ways I like to cook other ones, but battered and fried is usually hard to top.
Oysters are great battered and fried, like you said. One of my favorite things to do is even simpler. Really, is just saute them in some butter, chop them up, saute them in butter, and then just scramble some eggs in that, and have some scrambled eggs with those cooked mushrooms in there. That's one of my favorite ways. It's a good breakfast, and of course, you can do all kinds of other things with them too.
Yeah,
Really versatile mushroom.
yeah, they're a lot like most of your. Uh, they're similar to, like, I would say, like a baby portobello, or most of the mushrooms that you buy at the store that are your typical like cap and gill mushrooms. They're not much different than them.
No, not much different. Yeah, they're pretty much a good all-purpose mushroom. Yeah, and that's different than a lot of wild mushrooms. Like some wild mushrooms have textures of their very own and flavors of their very own, so they aren't as comparable to like a grocery store mushroom. For instance, morels or even chanterelles, they have their own thing going on. So that's one of my favorite parts of wild mushrooms, and one of the reasons I got really interested in them is because there are just so many different textures and flavors that you can get out of them, and it's not stuff you can just go buy at the store either. These are things that you can only find in the woods sometimes. I just like that aspect of it.
Another one of my absolute favorites that's also easy to identify and find is chicken of the woods. Just as far as
Yeah.
giant orange clumps of mushrooms that are delicious, which I see where, and I've been bad about it myself. Getting them when they're prime is kind of tricky. It seems like, and
Yeah.
I'd rather pick them younger than older, of course. Which it,
Yes,
the way I
definitely.
the way the way I've thought about it is, I mean, a mushroom is basically a bacteria sponge growing in the woods, uh, and the longer it sits there, the more bacteria it has, and it's kind of the way I think about it. But what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Old mushrooms definitely are a good place for bacteria to thrive. There's no doubt about that. But more of a concern with me on the age of a mushroom is just that the texture of a mushroom generally declines quite a bit as the mushroom matures. So, especially with polypore mushrooms, which are like the shelf kind of shaped mushrooms with pores underneath their shelves, chicken of the woods is one of the most well-known polypore. And it is, like you said, you got to get those things when they're pretty young, because after they're fully mature and they kind of start getting thin around the edges and their orange colors start to fade, and also the pores underneath will get much larger and have this kind of shaggy look to them, a little bit of a fuzzy feel. When you find them like that, they tend to be really dry and almost chalk-like on the inside, and there's really nothing that you can do to get rid of that. I've tried pressure cooking them. I've tried, boiling them for a really long time. I've tried marinating them in very flavorful thing, all kinds of different things, and that chalkiness just never goes away. And it's disappointing to, find a 20-pound mushroom that's too old. But I've certainly learned my lesson a few times. It took me a few times not to pick those old ones, and I would just be wasting my time mostly. So yeah, you got to get those chickens when they're brightly colored. Look at the edge of all of the shelves or fronds, if it's one that's growing, on the ground or from a stump. The edges of them, as they grow, tend to thin out. So if you find some and the edges are still very rounded and blunt, then
Mm-hmm.
that means that's still a good fresh chicken. And you can also do a squeeze test where you just kind of squeeze the whole shelf, and if it has some give to it, and if any liquid comes out of it when you squeeze it, some water, because you can tell it's just really still hydrated, then that's still good to go. If you squeeze it and it's kind of really, really firm and dry and no liquid comes out, and if you break a piece of it and it snaps similar to chalk or drywall or something like that, then it's too old. But if you find some that are still young and delicious, they're one of the very best wild mushrooms that grow in this area. They have their name for a reason. They don't look like chickens, but their texture is very much like chicken. And you can basically use that mushroom in any recipe that you would use chicken in, basically. So I've done all kinds of stuff. Chicken enchiladas. You can pressure cook or boil the chicken of the woods in some aromatics and seasonings, and then it shreds up just like shredded chicken. The texture is just spot on. So you can make all kinds of stuff with that. You can also just I like to boil them, cut them into strips, boil them for 10 minutes, and then batter and fry them. And they're just like chicken strips. Serve them with some good hot mayo or something, and you won't believe it.
I've never boiled them before. I fried them. I've always just kind of torn them into thin strips. Uh, and
Yeah, so the boiling thing, if you find really young ones, you don't want to boil them. But I do find that the boiling kind of improves their texture. It gets rid of a little bit of the firmness. And also, it's important to note that the chicken of the woods is one of the mushrooms that is most commonly reported as causing GI distress. So it's estimated about 10% of people that try that mushroom the first time will kind of get a little bit sick from it. Nothing deadly or anything, but GI distress. So that is definitely one that you want to try a little bit of the first time. And then if you're okay the next day, you didn't have any problems, then you can eat as much as you want.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've made the.
Sorry, and yeah, that 10-second or that 10-minute boiling also makes sure that the mushroom is completely cooked. And it's thought that a lot of these mushrooms that kind of give people belly aches and stuff, a lot of times it's a case of the person not cooking the mushroom enough. So a lot of mushrooms, you want to make sure that they're fully cooked. A lot of them have mild toxins in them or even serious toxins that are destroyed by heat. So it's important to cook them through. So yeah, that 10-minute boiling, especially if it's a middle-aged chicken of the woods that isn't super young and fresh and bubbly looking anymore. It's good to boil those 10 minutes. It's my recommendation.
Okay, that's good. I hadn't heard that either. Hen of the Woods are another big favorite of mine, which I don't have as much luck finding those. My brother is usually who I have to steal those from. Here in Oklahoma, a lot of the the Cherokee name for them, I believe, is wishy. So a lot of people refer to them in this
Yeah,
area as a wishy.
yeah, that's interesting to me because here where I live in Missouri, I've never heard that word before, but I did some reading about it, and it's really interesting to me. I would like to learn more about the traditional use of that mushroom by people, that call it that. That would be really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, hen of the woods, man. Hen of the woods is probably my favorite wild mushroom. It's definitely top three, and it is such a well kept secret that I almost don't even want to tell anyone. Because it's just really, it's a star of wild mushrooms. You find one, they average 5 to 10 pounds. Sometimes they can be 30, 40 pounds or even bigger. Often you'll find a few of them growing from the same spot. They like to grow at the base of dead or dying oak trees. Here in my region, they seem to tend to prefer red and black oak species, although I have found them on white oak. I'm not sure what kind of oaks are dominant there where you're at, but yeah, look for big oak trees in the fall. Usually October, some will start popping out, but I always think like mid to late October is prime hen of the woods time,
Mhm.
which maybe coincides with some sort of hunting too. Huh? Squirrel hunting is good
Mhm.
at that time, maybe.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I thought so yeah, people who are squirrel hunting are likely to encounter a hen of the woods. Now they don't pop out at you like a chicken of the woods, they're not that bright orange, beautiful color. They're kind of colored like leaves, really. They're just grayish brown color. They're very frilly and
They kind of
yeah.
look like a great big fluffed up owl laying on the ground. Just like looks like a giant clump of
Yeah,
owl feathers. Is the way we've kind of described them before.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's where they got their name, hen of the woods. It looks like a ruffled up chicken at the base of a tree. I've
Hmm.
also heard them called the oak leaf mushroom because people think they look so much like the oak leaves that they're usually growing out of. Anyway, look for dead or dying, even big old oak snags. I find them under those a lot, and sometimes they'll be grown a few feet out from like the roots that are just under the ground, so they won't be right at the base of the tree. But very often they're just right at the base of the tree, or even in a rotten old stump of a big old oak tree. So you're squirrel hunting out there in October, and you're up in the on the ridge tops in the timber. You have a really good chance of finding some hen in the woods, and if you do, just pluck that thing out of the ground and wipe off the dirt off the bottom or cut that dirty off of it. And pretty much that whole mushroom is good food. Throw any of it away unless it's all bug eaten or dirty. But yeah, you can come home with just one mushroom will give you 10 pounds of usable mushroom. And I like to use like the frond parts, the thinner kind of leafy looking parts.
Hmm.
I use those in my soups, and you can pickle them, which is really good. So you can kind of eat them all year if you do that. I really like that. Um, they're great. Just
Oh, I was gonna say I found that they what we do with them a lot is we'll uh, shred them into strips and vac seal them, and they freeze really well.
yeah, yeah. This mushroom is really good to save for later. You can also dehydrate them and just like put them in a canning jar or whatever and stick them in the cabinet. That's really easy. I've even had people tell me they just freeze the whole mushroom in a bag in their freezer and just leave it in there and take it out later and thaw it, and then it's fine. So I haven't tried that myself, but they are very like they're firm textured and they're really resilient. They stay on the woods floor for a real long time. If you find an old one, it's been there for a month maybe. So yeah, they keep really well, and man, their flavor is just it's not overpowering, but it's good and mushroomy. Their texture is really nice. The core part of the mushroom, once you use all those frond parts, once you get all those off there, the core is really solid and bright white, and it's really too tough to just saute it or something, or even just fry it. It'd probably be too tough, but it makes really good mushroom jerky. That's my favorite thing to do with the hen, probably is uh, slice it up and boil it for 10 minutes so you got your mushrooms cooked, and then marinate it about 12 to 24 hours in some kind of marinade, just like you would for beef jerky, whatever you like. I usually use like soy sauce and apple cider and a little bit of something hot in there, black pepper or sriracha or something.
Hmm.
Marinate it in the refrigerator and then put them in a dehydrator until basically they're dried up. It takes 8 hours or so, depending on how thick you cut your mushroom pieces. But that mushroom jerky is so good, and it's a really good way to use the center of a hen of the woods. And you can eat on that for a long time. It probably won't last very long, just like your deer jerky, doesn't last very long. So, because you eat it all.
So let's talk for a second about what the mushroom actually is, because I don't know that a lot of people really understand that the mushroom itself is really just more like the fruit. Like the mushroom you're seeing on top of the ground is about like an apple on a tree. It's not the actual, like the mycelium itself was where the actual kind of plant itself. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty much just the basic concept of fungi that 95+% of people just are not even aware of. And I try to remember that I wasn't aware of it either when I first started learning about mushrooms because it just really isn't accentuated very much in school. So just most people have very little knowledge about mushrooms or fungi in general. So the way this works, a fungus is the name that we give to the entire organism. There are lots of fungi on the planet, probably over a million, and fungi basically are in charge of breaking things down, as well as lots of other important roles, but that's the one we think of the most. So when they do this, when we say a fungus, we're actually referring to the whole organism, and it's composed of a bunch of tiny little threads that we call hyphae. And when those hyphae kind of stick together, they form a mass that we call mycelium. And everyone listening to this has seen mycelium before. If you've ever picked up a wad of leaves in the woods or kicked over a rotten old log and you see some kind of white, stringy, maybe moldy looking or spider webby looking, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people say that is fungal mycelium. So what that stuff does is it spreads through the leaves or the trees, the stumps or whatever, anything that is dead or dying. and it breaks it down by releasing enzymes. And then it uses the energy that it gets from these enzymes as it's crawling through that rotten log and getting more and more energy. It turns all of its attention to making what we call fruit bodies. And you mentioned the apple on a tree analogy, and that's a pretty good one. So when we see a mushroom growing from the ground or growing from a stump or wherever it is, it's actually just the temporary reproductive structure of the organism that lives inside whatever that mushroom is growing from. So whether it's a stick that you picked up off the forest floor, or it's a big rotten old stump with a bunch of mushrooms growing on it, or if it's just growing right out of the ground, that mushroom that we see for just a short time usually is actually just the temporary reproductive structure. Its entire purpose is to emerge from the substrate, come out of the ground, out of the log, whatever, and emits spores into the air. And spores are kind of like the seeds of a fungus. They're not the same as seeds, but it's a good way to think of it. They're microscopic dust particles that basically get carried away through wind currents, and they land somewhere else and they germinate and they grow another patch of this thin, wispy white stuff called mycelium. And eventually that mycelium will get enough food and it will grow some more fruit bodies, which we call mushrooms. So that's why you only see mushrooms for a short time. That's why we don't have morels all year long. They just, that species likes to pop out its fruit bodies in the spring before there's a lot of tree cover and right when the temperatures are warm enough. So we only see them for a short time. But the morel fungus itself lives in that area all the time. It's there right now. It's just we don't ever see it because it's under the ground. A lot of mushrooms don't break down dead things, growing directly from the ground, and it's just like an umbrella-shaped mushroom, cap and stem. A lot of times, those mushrooms are what we call mycorrhizal fungi, kind of a big word, and it basically means mushroom root. And so mycorrhizal fungi, instead of breaking down sticks and leaves and all these other things, their mycelium actually coats the roots of plants, and generally the mushrooms that you see in the woods are interacting with the roots of trees. So what they do is they coat the roots of trees, they mine water from deeper than the roots could otherwise reach, and they provide that water to the plant. And they also break down things in the surrounding environment of the roots and provide minerals and other nutrients, soil to the trees. In exchange, the trees photosynthesize using their leaves, creating sugars, and they actually provide some of those sugars to the fungus that is living on the roots. So it's this really kind of fantastic symbiotic relationship that we don't ever see really happening. So we've only discovered this in the last several decades. So pretty cool stuff. Fungi are just always there, basically. They're the workhorses of the forest. They're the ones that recycle everything that dies in the forest, and they also facilitate the life of everything that's living in the forest. So it's really pretty incredible. They're kind of like nature's unseen puppet masters, if you will, because we only see them for a short time when they decide to pop out those mushrooms.
Kind of something that I've seen that is not controversial so much, but going back kind of towards the mycelium idea is I've heard a lot of people say that like you need to when you're picking morels you need to take a knife and cleanly cut the mushroom off. Don't pull it up off out of the ground or it won't grow back. And I've heard people say that because a lot of times like with the hen of the woods you'll find multiple clumps all kind of in one general area. And I've heard people say that like if you pick them all, you'll none of them will come back the next year. And that's the nice thing about a lot of these mushrooms is they will pop back up year after year after year in the same places.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. There's just a lot of general misinformation about wild mushrooms in general, and even what I just explained to you, mycorrhizal and breaking down the nutrient cycle and stuff. Hardly most people don't know that. They just don't realize that
Mm-hmm.
that is happening, and that's fine. Um, but there's a lot of other kind of misinformation that I always find strange. The pulling the mushroom out or cutting it kind of argument. There's always a lot of heated exchanges about that, and I'm not sure how that got to be such an important thing to everyone, but it has been found without a doubt that pulling a mushroom out of the ground does not affect the fungus itself. The mushroom is actually meant to be disposed of in some way, whether it's trampled on by a bear or whether it's eaten by a squirrel or whether it's deteriorated by bacteria and other fungi or whether bugs are going to eat it or whatever. The mushroom doesn't matter anymore to the fungus itself, basically, once it's made. The mushroom is out there, it's going to do its job. It might get eaten by something. It might spread all of its spores for a week and, get out there to as many places as possible. But the fungus itself is not harmed when you pick the mushroom from the ground. So I pull them up and trim off the dirty base and leave it behind. I try not to destroy anything in the process. If it's really stuck under something, or if it's a big morel and it has a giant wad of dirt, I'll cut that piece off and kind of stick it back in the hole that I picked it out of. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't hurt the fungus to pull a mushroom out of the ground. So that's one thing. Now, it is important to, you mentioned, people say if you pick all the hens, you won't ever get any more. And now the fungus itself is living in that tree that you found the hen by, and it will keep living there as long as the food supply exists. And every year it will get bigger and bigger and bigger until the food source is almost gone. Then it will kind of get weaker for a couple of years. So there's this definite trajectory of whether you're going to get a hen of the woods or not from a specific stump. But picking the fruit body itself, again, does not harm the fungus in the tree, as long as you're not like ripping out big chunks of the stump when you're doing it or anything like that. That dead tree is going to stay there and the fungus lives in there, and you picking its mushroom doesn't make a difference. Like, it doesn't care. It made the mushroom to get the spores into the environment. Other than that, it's barely even a part of its body anymore. So it's no problem to pick all the mushrooms. It has been found that if you pick all of the saprobic mushrooms, so these are ones that are growing on fallen logs, like a chicken of the woods or an oyster mushroom, if you pick all of those, it has been found that that could potentially reduce future harvests, because they do rely a little more on spore dispersal to spread around the forest than mycorrhizal mushrooms do. Because these mycorrhizal ones, living with the roots of trees, they'll live the tree as long as the tree lives usually. So it could be 200 more years if the tree, gets to live that long. But they don't, their spore dispersal isn't as important to them as a fungus, because they basically are really well established. And spore dispersal is just a way to spread their genetics to another part of the forest. But with saprobic ones, their food source actually runs out way faster than that, right? Like a log, an oyster mushroom you'll find on the same log for maybe 5 years, and then it won't be there anymore because it already ate all the stuff in that log that it wanted, but it had to make spores all that time to get to other logs. So it's a little more important to not over harvest mushrooms that grow on wood, is my recommendation.
Another one that I find a lot of, especially in the fall, winter time, more so in the fall, but puffballs. And a lot of times they grow. There's a ton of them. There's a few different types.
Yeah.
I like to saute them. I'll slice them up thin, and then I'll saute them with like some garlic salt, and add them to like an Alfredo dish. They're really good like that.
Well, that's a good idea. Yeah, I've never tried that. I like puffballs. They're great. They're one of the easiest mushrooms to learn because they're just so distinctive. They're a big ball. They don't have a cap and stem or any of that. They usually grow right from the ground, except for a species or two that grows on wood. So yeah, puffballs are great. And there are a lot of species that grow in this region, but all puffballs are edible when you slice them open in half from top to bottom and look at the inside. If the inside is all white, then they're edible and it's okay to eat them. So they're one of the easiest mushrooms to learn how to eat. Now, if you cut the puffball open and it's turning yellow, or if there's green or yellow or brown or purple or black or any other color, then that either means you don't have a true puffball, or your puffball is just too old and you can't eat it at that point. So it's a good rule. Cut those puffballs in half. If they're white inside, then they're okay to eat. Keep in mind that there is one type of toxic mushroom called an amanita, and some of these amanitas can be mistaken for puffballs when they're in their very immature form, because those type of mushrooms come out of this kind of underground structure that resembles an egg. And it's usually just below the surface of the ground, but sometimes if there's been some kind of disturbance, maybe a tree fell over or an animal dug them up, sometimes you'll see those amanita eggs above ground. So you want to cut your puffballs in half at first, just to make sure they're not bad. If you cut an amanita egg in half, you will actually see the outline of a little tiny mushroom in there, the mushroom that was going to come out of the egg if you hadn't cut it in half. And you'll kind of imagine how it looks when you cut a button mushroom, and you can kind of look at the side of it, and you can see the outline of the cap and the stem and the gills there. You'll
Hmm.
see that inside the ball. That is not a very common thing to happen, but if you find like a whole bunch of puffballs growing on the ground all in one place, and you cut one in half and it's a puffball and it's okay, then the likelihood of all of those puffballs right there in that spot being that same one are very high. So
They've got a texture very much like if you cut a marshmallow in half, as far as just the way
they
they
do.
look. Uh, don't taste like one, but they
Yeah.
sure look like one when you cut a prime one.
Yeah, I always tell people they're umami marshmallows, because yeah, they're very marshmallowy, but they're very, they have a mushroomy flavor. So yeah, puffballs are great and an easy one to learn. I like the medium sized puffballs that are kind of brown on the outside and they have a little bit of a mosaic pattern to them. They're about softball size up to a little bigger than that. That one's called the purple spored puffball, and it's one of my favorites. And it shows up. You can find it in the woods sometimes, but usually it'll pop up on the edge of the woods, like on the edge of somebody's yard, or even right in your yard. So that's a good one to learn. It's really common in this area.
Yeah, I find a lot of that. I think they're called gem-studded puffballs, which they only get about the size of a quarter. So usually they grow on dead logs, and they'll be just a log will just be covered with them at times.
Yeah, there's a couple of those. There's several species of those little bitty puffballs there. The one that grows on wood is the pear-shaped puffball, and yeah, you'll see that thing with like hundreds of them sometimes, just all up and down a log. And then there's the gem studded grows right from the ground, and there's several that are very similar to that species that are just little kind of small puffballs that grow from the ground. I always think of them as like ping pong ball size.
Hmm.
That's about as big as they get. And I don't, I mean, I have eaten all of those, but I don't really collect those little ones for food very much just because they're pretty small and the outer skin on them doesn't cook at the same rate as the interior. So I always feel like I have to peel them and then it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I usually just saute them up and eat them like they are. Slice them and saute them. I'm not too picky though, but well, we've touched on morels, which I didn't want
Definitely a
to
good
spend.
mushroom to learn though.
Yeah, I didn't want to spend too much time on morels just because it's already such a well known mushroom, and it's not one that people really have many questions about. But on that note, but no, so something I've seen a lot of controversy on is the false morels, the big red ones that look like a giant morel, with a kind of a red cap with a white stem, that grow around the same time of year, a little earlier than standard morels, I think. I've read where they're poisonous, and I've read, but at the same time, I know a lot of people that have eaten them and have eaten them their whole life with no problems. What do you have to chime in on that?
Yeah, the ever controversial so-called false morels. I don't like calling them false morels because they're not trying to be a morel. They're somewhat related to morels, but pretty different if you really look at their identifying features. And so here in Missouri, we have three species in the genus Gyrometra, which is the genus of the false morels. By the way, I like the word lorkel, so spread that out to your people. Call those false morels lorkels. It's an old word for them, and I feel like it's less derogatory. Um, so these mushrooms, there are three species in that genus here in Missouri, and where you live is probably the same, Oklahoma there. If you get into more northern states here in the Midwest, if you're up into Michigan and northern Illinois, Wisconsin, all the northern parts of the Midwest, there are other species in this genus that occur there. So what I'm going to say doesn't apply to all of those. It only applies to the three here in Missouri. The one that is the most common and the most known is, like you said, the red morel or big red morel. This one is Gyrometra caroliniana, and this is a member of the lorkel family that grows in more southern parts of the United States. And we're kind of on the northern edge of its range. So the other two species that grow here are less common. One is the pig's ears Gyrometra brunea. The other is Gyrometra corpii or gigas, and it's really uncommon. So the red morel is the one that most people are familiar with. And like you said, it kind of looks like a really big morel that turned red. But if you look carefully, you'll see that it's actually quite different from morel. morel. Morels are their cap is composed of a series of pits and ridges, and the lorquels are composed of wrinkles and folds that are reddish in color in that species, and morels never are red. Also, the red morel has the lorquel has a really large stem, a massive chalk white stem that is usually about the same thickness or diameter as the cap. Not quite, but really close to it. So it's not like a small stem with a big old cap on it. It's just the whole thing is really massive. Now, as far as edibility, this is where the controversy comes in. They are listed as deadly poisonous in most field guides, unless they've been published in the last 2 years or so. And that's mostly because a lot of people just don't know a lot about mushrooms, and we're constantly learning about mushrooms still. And I say we as in like scientific community of mycologists who are trying to figure out fungi. We're always learning more stuff all the time about these groups of mushrooms. And come to find out, which has been suspected for decades, and you said you've talked to lots of people who have eaten them for years, and me too, I have too. So it's been suspected that the three species that grow in Missouri are not toxic because they're basically in the same separate family of the genus as these other species that are also thought to be non-toxic. And then there are other families in Gyrometra that contain all toxic species. So for a long time, a lot of leading toxic mushroom experts have been saying, well, we think that this group, this family in the genus Gyrometra, this subfamily called a clade, is actually all non-toxic, and we think these are all toxic, and then these are all non-toxic, and that kind of thing. So we kind of had it figured out, but recently in the last few years, there was a pretty good study done. I wish it had involved more specimens, but it did cover a wide range of species. So they collected specimens of all these different lorquels that grow all over North America, and they used this fancy new chromatography method to test for the toxins that have been thought to be in a lot of these lorquels. And none of the species that grow in Missouri were found to be toxic. And actually, all of the results of pretty extensive testing showed that the theory that was already developing about these kind of subfamilies of these lorquels being toxic or not has been borne out. So now we see that if the mushroom is in this family of Gyrometra, then it's one of the non-toxic ones. If it's in this one, it's toxic. Luckily for us here in Missouri, all three of our species are in a non-toxic clade, or non-toxic genus. So that means that despite the continuing controversy, it's perfectly safe to eat the false morels that grow here in Missouri. Make sure you check your region, see what species grow there. If you're listening to this from some other area of the U.S., but here in Missouri, our three species are non-toxic. They can be consumed just like a regular morel as long as they are fully cooked. So this is actually an important side note that morels are actually quite toxic when raw and even when undercooked. So it's important to cook your morels fully before you consume them. And the same goes for these big red morels or any of the other lorquels that grow here in Missouri that are non-toxic. You want to make sure and fully cook them. So that's not usually a problem because mushrooms hold up really well to pretty prolonged cooking times. You don't have to worry about like burning your mushroom in 5 minutes or whatever. So just make sure they're really well cooked. If you travel outside of Missouri, or if you're in a different kind of bioregion, if you go to northern states, if you go to the mountains, the Rockies, if you go to the Northeast, if you go to the Pacific Northwest, they do have other species of lorquels there that are toxic unless you do special preparation, boiling them in 2 changes of water. Don't breathe the fumes, they can kill you, that kind of thing. So luckily here where I live, we don't have any of those toxic lorquels or false morels.
Well, that is
And
good to
this
know.
will, it's going to take a long time for this to kind of disseminate out to everyone. And the Mycological Society has been trying to kind of get the word out and just direct people toward what the science is saying. And really what the science is saying is what the old timers have been saying the whole time. When I first got into mushrooms, I had the same book you're talking about, Maxine, my friend Maxine's book. And I was talking to the old timers about mushrooms, and they said, oh, my favorite's the red morel. And I looked in my book and it has the skull and crossbones and all these terrible things about rocket fuel. And I thought, man, these guys are crazy. And it took me a long time before I actually ate a lorkel myself because I was afraid. All the folks told me not to. But now the kind of the story is becoming much clearer, and we're starting to get a pretty good handle on the toxicity of them. So if you're in Missouri and eat those red morels, just make sure you cook them all the way.
I have never eaten one myself, but now I guess next time I bump across one, I'll have to pluck it out and see what they're about.
I would make sure it is what you think it is. Send me a picture. I'll be glad to help.
Yeah, yeah, I've found them on quite a few occasions. I just usually just look at them
Yeah,
and walk on past.
yeah. No, they're. I mean, I'm not trying to tell everybody to go eat every false morel they find, but they're one of my favorites. They're delicious. Very meaty texture, super firm, really, really good. Strong flavored, similar to a morel, but maybe like more strong tasting than a morel.
Yeah,
Good stuff.
the first time I ever found a bunch of morels, which I wouldn't say I grew up morel hunting, but back around high school times, like was really when I was introduced more to morels. And every time we
Yeah.
went and found a good batch, there's usually 8 or 10 of us out hunting together, and just never really had a chance to just eat a lot of them. So it was always kind of a treat. And then I lived in Kansas after college, and I found about 20 of them by myself, and I just gorged myself on them. And man, I got sicker than a dog from that. Whew, I got
Oh man.
sick.
Yeah, you can definitely overeat when it comes to fried mushrooms. If you eat a big old pile of them, think of how much butter or oil you're eating.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, but it's hard to not eat a bunch of them. But yeah, you're not alone. That's happens.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I sure appreciate you coming on. We're about up on time for what I had for the episode, but man, this has been a great interview, and I know that I've learned a lot, and I feel like anybody that listens is also going to learn a lot. And I just want to say we really appreciate your time and for you agreeing to come on here and educate us about them.
Hey, yeah, I really appreciate you having me on here. And I wanted to plug the Missouri Mycological Society. Please just go check out the website. It's momyco.org. Join the club. All the money from registration fees and everything that we do goes back into the community to provide educational opportunities about fungi and also to advance the scientific understanding of regional mushrooms. Also, please check out my business, Wildwise Botanicals. We have a website with a list of events that I'll be doing. If you want to learn more about mushrooms, find us on social media, check out the website. Also, I have a book coming out early next year. It is a Falcon guide, and it's called Foraging Mushrooms of the Ozarks. Looking forward to that.
I will be looking forward to getting a copy.
All right. Thanks a lot, Colby.
You guys, everybody listen, take care, and keep wearing out that boot leather. I just want to give everyone that's listening a sincere thank you. Getting this podcast going has been a project. I really hope you're enjoying it, and if you don't mind, give the show a good rating and review wherever you're listening to it at, or share it on your social media to help get some traction. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.